Welcome to the Society and Ethics Research Group seminar series. And I'm Anna Middleton and I'm head of the group. And the group is part of Connecting Science. There are 4 different groups in Connecting Science and we're all on campus. And we're so delighted to see you here today. So we're going to be filming because there was a few requests on Twitter for Felicity's talk. So we'll make that available after today. If anybody doesn't want to be filmed, let me know and we'll blank your head out or don't ask a question. And so I'd like to just introduce Felicity Boardman, Professor Felicity Boardman, who's from the University of Warwick. And you might have heard her on Radio 4, you might have seen her writing in the press. She's very well known for talking about ethics and genomics and disability issues, and she's done some fantastic talks recently with the genetic counselling profession. So welcome to Felicity, and we've got an hour and we'll have about 15 minutes or so for questions. Is that okay?
something like that. I'm hoping that we'll have a good chance to get into some questions because I'm sure this will probably raise some questions.
Yeah, okay, very informal. Okay, thanks Felicity.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone, thank you for coming. You may look at the title on the screen and think that's rather an odd title, Unravelling Disabilities DNA. We don't think about disability as having DNA, we think about medical conditions having DNA associated with it. So we can't think about the genetic origins of wheelchair use, but we can talk about, for example, in my case, neuromuscular disease. And I'm here today to give you a sort of slightly different perspective on medical conditions. And if we think of disability as being the social consequence of impairments, of genetic conditions, so it's things like what it's like to live with stigma, what it's like to not be able to get into a room or a building, or to have lost those abilities, or to have never had them before. All of those things make up the experience of having different types of medical conditions, but they are not necessarily incorporated within the diagnosis. So the way in which you respond to it, like the sort of, living with stigma, that kind of thing, we just don't have that communicated through a medical diagnosis in the same way that when you're living that reality, you become very familiar with it. So to take you back a few steps in this argument that I'm going to be making today, I wanted to set the scene a little bit. Why is the question of disability so important at the moment? Why are we seeing these talks in the radio and on the television about disability and genetic medicine? And I think part of this is coming from the fact that we've got new technologies now. So it's really challenging not only the number of decisions that prospective parents are having to make, but it's also changing the nature of the decisions they're having to make. And with this sort of mainstreaming of whole genome exome sequencing within standard NHS care, we've now got new possibilities for genetic screening at population level. So there's a real shift from, I suppose, sort of targeted genetic testing within families to almost like a broader public health approach to genomics. And that real shift is, I think, at the heart of a lot of the issues that are going to be presented today, because it's about bringing genomics to many more people than before. People who may not be familiar with genetics at all, they may not have a genetic condition in the family, but it means that more people without that background are going to be able to access and come under the remit of genomic medicine. And I feel like we're at a point now where we're not only thinking what can be done with genetic technologies, we're also thinking what should be done now that we've got these abilities. Okay? One of the key things is that this shift to whole genome sequencing, exome sequencing, and public health genomics is simply the massive rise in the amount of data that can be gained from this type of technological intervention. And how we wade through all the information that could come out of a genetic sequence is not only, I suppose, a clinical decision, it's also a highly social one. Because most often, the way that decisions are made around which things we should screen for, which things we should test for, are based around this rather nebulous notion of disease severity. But what's really striking is that we have no way of defining what severity is. And yet it's so important to the practice of genomics and so important to reproduction. For example, the notion of disease severity affects abortion law. So the typical 24-week upper limit on pregnancy termination is lifted in cases where the fetus is likely to have a serious abnormality. So, but that idea of severity, again, isn't clearly defined. So it comes down to a lot of subjective judgments by doctors as to which conditions are acceptable under that law. But it's also how we consider screening programs. So if a condition is being put forward to be considered by the UK National Screening Committee, they have to be able to demonstrate that it's a significant health problem. And often significant means that it has serious impacts for the person who has that condition. So it's not only about its prevalence, it's also about how it affects people. But it's also relevant to the return of incidental findings. So as genomic sequencing is increasingly being used within research, vast amounts of information are being generated about people. And how do we sort through it all? How do we decide this finding should be returned to them? They can't not know this information. And again, often it comes down to how serious the disease is, but also how it might affect other people in their family and biologically related kin. Now, the HFEA, they have to make these kinds of judgments about disease severity because they need to use it when they are granting licenses for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So the way they've gone about defining severity is they looked at the penetrance of the genetic variant, the age of onset of the condition, symptoms and impact of them, again, which is kind of quite nebulous. They want to know about treatment, what type of treatment, how invasive and how effective it is. They also want to know about quality of life, but also the variability and range of possible symptoms. So they want to know, okay, if this is a spectrum condition, in its mildest possible form, does it need to be treated? And is there a way for us to determine before that child is born where on that spectrum of severity they will be? Because you might have a very different attitude towards selective termination if you have a baby on the milder end of the scale versus the severe end. So are we able to differentiate that? Or is it that parents will end up treating every diagnosis as potentially being on the severe end of the scale as almost like a kind of protection to cover all possibilities? So what I've also noticed is that people living with genetic conditions themselves often haven't been included in these types of debates, and that lack is really surprising. And it's surprising because people with genetic disabilities have what I refer to as, and this term is coined by Abel and Browner, this notion of experiential knowledge. So this is a type of knowledge that you don't get through learning in a traditional way or sort of absorbing information. It's about your direct physical sensory interactions with the world and the way in which you accumulate those and they are fed into your personal identity, what you do with your life, those kinds of things. So experiential knowledge is sort of divided up into two parts. So they talk about your own experiential knowledge, which is your own experiences through your body, but you can also have empathetic experiential knowledge, and that would refer to thinking about the experiences of a condition through the eyes of someone very close to it. So that might be a carer or a family member, for example. So, and another reason, I mean, them having this experiential knowledge is a really important point to make, because it's one of the reasons, one of the justifications for including disabled people in these arguments, that they are the people who best know their conditions. They know it in a way that clinicians can never know it unless they've got the condition in their family. But there are other reasons as well why we might want to bring people with genetic conditions into this debate. And I've listed some of them here. It's long been argued that there are implications for people with genetic conditions that go beyond those that might be expected for the rest of the population. So, for example, a change in the public profile of the disease. So when a disease goes from something that was once a chance occurrence, but now becomes preventable, could potentially have significant impacts for them. Largely in terms of stigma, and I was thinking about some interviews that I did with some parents of children with Down syndrome. And they were saying to me, people, when they see me and my child, they often say to me, well, didn't you know? Why didn't you do something about it? And I was really shocked that these questions are being asked, but they are being asked because as soon as the screening program is available, they are suggesting that there is a responsibility to use that screening program. And therefore, children who are living with screen for conditions are then almost sort of being forced into sort of almost like justification of their own existence because their parents decided not to go down that route. Another concern that's been raised has been referred to as the expressivist objection to selective reproduction. And the expressivist objection is this idea that by undertaking genetic intervention in reproduction, that we are somehow sending a message to people with disabilities that society would have preferred it had they not been born at all. And that's where this expressivist objection comes from, that disabled people feel that maybe their disability is part of their cultural identity, part of their personal identity. They may just not see it in the same way as a medical professional does, and linked to that, they may then feel offended when someone then terminates a pregnancy affected by one of the conditions. But there's also the concern about potential reductions in resources. So it could also be the case that as with any screening program that's brought in, the incidence of a condition declines, we see less and less people of it, and with it, and then along with that, potential reductions in research funding. We all know that when we're trying to apply for funding for a research grant, again, having to justify that this is an important health problem. But is it an important health problem when very few people now have it? So that might then also impact on people currently living with the condition, who perhaps aren't having, whose condition perhaps isn't the focus of the same research as it was before. And the final one, peer-to-peer support. And what I mean by that is having someone in the world who's got the same condition as you. And again, this really came out really profoundly for me when I spoke to these parents of children with Down syndrome. And one mother said to me, and it stayed with me, she said, you can't underestimate the value of my son with Down syndrome being able to walk into a room and see other people with his same facial characteristics, his sense of belonging. So there's a kind of concern around whether or not that would alter with the introduction of sort of more population-based genomic sequencing. Not only that, but the final reason as well why we might want to include disabled people is that this experiential knowledge that I've mentioned is highly relevant to many more people. Because if screening expands and we're having to make reproductive decisions about larger and larger numbers of conditions, this really sort of rich way of knowing that condition that can only be accessed by the people who actually have that condition is highly relevant to the reproductive decisions of the general population. So it might be that, as is going on in Denmark at the moment, that when a prenatal diagnosis is made, the family are then put in touch with the family who've got a child affected with that condition. So that's what I mean by the experiential knowledge of these families becoming more relevant to more and more people in society. But obviously, with screening, it could also potentially be an increasingly dwindling resource. So there's a few things to think about there in relation to this kind of experiential knowledge. So I was really interested in the difference in decision-making between people who have genetic conditions and people from the general population. So I'm in the final year at the moment of a Wellcome Trust funded study on the social and ethical aspects of genetic screening. And we did interviews with people with very different types of impairments. We did 108 interviews with them. And we also did some interviews with 31 people who were taking part in the 100,000 Genome Project. And for all these people, we asked them about their views on prenatal screening at population level, preconception, prenatal, and newborn screening. So we're asked about all these potential programs in relation to the condition they live with. Would you support the introduction of this type of screening? And I'm going to show you some of the data that came out of those interviews a little bit later on. So these are the genetic conditions that we included in the study. I'm not going to actually talk very much today about the 100,000 Genome Project because I want to focus more on the views of the families. So we had cystic fibrosis, thalassemia, Fragile X, haemophilia, and spinal muscular atrophy. And these conditions were chosen partly because they are relatively common in the world of genetics, but also because they have such different presentations. I wanted to explore, are there particular types of presentation of a condition that makes people more inclined to use genetic testing and potentially pregnancy termination? What are the things that sort of worry people the most? And I wanted to know about this, both from the perspective of affected families, but I also wanted to do a comparison with people from the general population. What do these families have that could be relevant and that people from the general public might want? So So this is what the study looked like in the end. So we did, as I say, 108 qualitative interviews asking the question, how do individuals living with genetic disease view screening? We then used these interviews to develop a survey, which we then distributed to explore how widespread the views were. And to try and make it as accurate as possible, where we could, we actually used verbatim text. So we used word-for-word text of the participants, and we formed them into sort of attitude statements. So then the participants could either agree or disagree with what had been said by someone else with their condition. And I found that actually in practice that worked really well, and I really thought it was really important that we stuck with some of the ideas that had been raised by these families rather than us assuming what might be important to them. And then finally at the end we did an integration of the qualitative and quantitative data. This is just very briefly, that's just a sort of reflection of the data that we've got so far. Our surveys, a few of them, oh, you can't read the totals at the bottom. We've got 414 survey returns for haemophilia, 187 for thalassemia, and the cystic fibrosis and Fragile X surveys are still in progress. But as I say, 108 interviews overall. So I wanted to now move us on to having a little think about some of the findings of this project, and I think this is where we may be able to generate some discussion around. So one of the key things that I found when speaking to families with genetic conditions and thinking about what genomic medicine would mean for them, I found that, perhaps unsurprisingly, that living with the diagnosis of a genetic condition for families was often experienced as a transformative experience. That these were people who often said things like, you know, I wouldn't have been able to cope if I'd known beforehand. But actually, they find themselves in that situation and they're looking back thinking, why did I think that? Because there's typically no family history, and what the parents often reported as well is that they often saw a mismatch between what was described to them about this condition at diagnosis versus actually what the lived reality of their family life was. So what I also noticed is that how much experiential knowledge you have makes a difference as well, because there was a really noticeable difference between sporadic cases of haemophilia and the children of obligate carriers. Because I found that the obligate carriers who often had, say, fathers affected, had grown up with haemophilia. And often they had a much more positive take on haemophilia than did the families who were sort of identified as sporadic cases and they hadn't yet heard of it before. So I'll just move this on. So this is a quote from Ginny, who was 38 at the time of her interview, and she was the mother of Finley, who was a 4-year-old boy diagnosed with haemophilia. And she said, when Finley was diagnosed, they were telling me my son had this horrible disease that I had only vaguely heard of. But yeah, I absolutely would have been one of those people saying, this isn't right, I'm going to terminate, because I was ignorant, really, and knew no better. So she's really kind of highlighting there the mismatch that she had, and this is an edited quote, so there was some more to it as well. She went on to highlight that there was a real mismatch between what she felt the clinicians had said to her at diagnosis and actually what it was like to live with Finley. And I said as well that there was a mismatch between the obligate and sporadic carriers, and that came up in the haemophilia interviews as well. So this is Emma, who's age 40, and she was the daughter of a man with haemophilia A, but she also had 2 affected cousins with haemophilia as well. And she reacted to the idea of genomic medicine quite differently to some of the other parents who had only found out that they were carriers through the birth of their child rather than having the family history. She said, I think when I was first offered the testing, she means an invasive prenatal test, when I was pregnant, it took me a bit off guard. I've always been around haemophilia. My dad has it, 2 of my cousins have it. There was no way I would have had that test because I wouldn't have terminated for a condition that we can manage. A kid with haemophilia would be really lucky to be born into a family like ours because we are so clued up, you know. So that's, I think, quite an interesting response to it, in that she's really prioritizing the experiential forms of knowledge in managing and dealing with this condition, because the medical care would presumably be the same for a child that's born of a sporadic or obligate carrier, but here she's really telling us that actually that kind of experience made such a big difference to the family, to the pregnancy, and ultimately deciding to not test and keep that pregnancy. But as well as these kind of differences between the people who had a family history of the condition and those who didn't, there was also differences between the different impairment groups. So remember, I've got quite a wide range of conditions included with very different presentations. And I found that within these impairment groups, there were particular trends in that certain impairment groups were much more likely to support screening than others. And if I show you here, I've got two sort of one at either end of the spectrum here to show you. This is Rosie, sorry. She had type 2 SMA and she was 20 at the time of her interview. And she took a very extreme position on this. She said, oh God, yeah, I just hate it. She's referring to reproductive genetic medicine. I mean, it's genocide for the modern era, isn't it? It's portrayed as a sophisticated and progressive new thing. But in reality, all they're doing is bumping the babies off, aren't they? So she's really, and this wasn't uncommon amongst people living with type 2 SMA, and I'll get on in a little bit about why I think that was. But she was very much like, this isn't something I want to be involved with. I see it as genocide. And they see it, some people actually saw it as like a hate crime against disabled people to be using these kinds of technologies. So there were some very kind of extreme views. But at the other end of that spectrum, we have then Chiara's viewpoint, who was 44 and had thalassemia. And she was saying, there's so much ignorance, and that is why many children continue to be born with unnecessary diseases like thalassemia. It's just not acceptable. I think the problem is that parents are selfish and thinking only of their desire to have a child and not the child itself. So here we're kind of seeing how, in this context of genomics and reproduction, that different kinds of responsibility are butting heads here. There's a sort of responsibility that parents felt they had to have a child that would not suffer. But they were also balancing that against, as some other participants pointed out, they're also balancing it against feeling that as a parent, they need to be open to whatever child they might have and to accept and love that child. So there was kind of this push-pull going on in a lot of their answers. They found themselves sort of living in quite this contradictory space. So why was this going on? Why was I seeing that amongst people with thalassemia and people with type 2 SMA, that their viewpoints were often extremely polarized? And what emerged as being most important as to why these different viewpoints were emerging was to do with identity and identity politics. So what I found was that the more a person has integrated their impairment or their condition into their sense of self, the less likely they were to support screening. The people who supported screening were typically people who saw their condition as something outside of themselves. They saw it as an unwelcome burden on their lives. And the difference, as I did the analysis on all this data, I found that there are various dimensions of experience that can influence that. So things like the age of onset of the condition, its stability or deterioration, the availability of associated burden of medical treatment, whether or not it involves illness and suffering, but also social conditions and stigma. All of these factors were playing a role in how far these people with disabilities actually took their condition into their sense of self. And we have a quote here, and this is a guy called Seth, who was 32 years old, and he's actually a GP, and he had cystic fibrosis. And he really felt that he identified with other people with cystic fibrosis, including fetuses. So what he said was, I can understand why somebody might want to find out, i.e. whether or not the child's got a condition, but it's just too close to home and too hypocritical for me to think it's okay to abort someone with one condition when I've also got a condition myself, because that then opens the door to someone aborting me or someone else with cystic fibrosis. So he's making quite a kind of imaginative leap here, in that he's identifying with that fetus and other potential fetuses that have the same condition as him, and he was really feeling that actually CF can be part of my identity, and there's no, it doesn't necessarily have to be a negative label. And then we have here Julia, who had type 3 SMA, so not type 2 that we saw with Rosie earlier. This is a milder presentation of SMA, generally speaking. And she said, some parts of it, living with SMA, don't bother me at all, and probably not the parts most people think. Most people think not being able to walk or dress yourself are the worst things about it, but they're not, actually, especially for me when I've never done those things in the first place. And I think she really kind of, what becomes clear there is that she's anticipating what other things people might prioritise, and they didn't match up with hers, because she had this rich experiential knowledge of what life was like, and her priorities were just very different to how she was imagining them to be for a member of the population. She went on to make some interesting comments about how she as well compartmentalised her condition in her head. So there was almost like a disability part of it, which included, in her case, wheelchair access to buildings. It was about dismantling stigma and negative attitudes to disability. But then she also had in her mind part of the experience of SMA that could not be changed by those social factors. So the fact that she had a lot of back pain from having scoliosis in her spine, the fact that she got frequent chest infections. And she said to me, you can always find a way round physical barriers, and sometimes attitudinal, but I can't exactly find a new way to breathe, can I? So she was really sort of highlighting that, yes, there are some aspects of that experience that are amenable to social manipulation, but others that aren't. So where does that leave us? What I found, and you may be picking up on this from what I've said already, is that disease classifications did not seem to map in any straightforward way onto these lived experience I was finding. So what I was finding, for example, is that the families affected by type 2 SMA and the individuals with type 2 were often much more positive and satisfied with their lives than people with type 3. And people with type 3 have clinically milder symptoms. So this is Rachel here, and she said, my sister with type 3 hates having SMA. She resents it every single day. But the funny thing is, everyone expects me to be the bitter one because I'm type 2, whereas she can still walk. But I've never known any different, and she has. And this contrast between being born with a condition, having a condition that's relatively stable, and having a condition that being able to plan your life around that particular condition had a massive impact on how it was actually experienced. So all this stuff that a medical diagnosis can't get at. And type 3 SMA, this is, as I say, a much milder condition, but people have to go through a period of loss. They have to sort of, I could walk this distance last year, now I can't. It's the kind of, almost like the grieving process for how they used to be. And I think ultimately, it wasn't the resultant level of disability that seemed to make people react in this way. It was the process of deterioration. So even if, for example, Chloe had been diagnosed with type 2, and perhaps even been more severe than Rachel, she was more likely to be able to cope with that better than being type 3, is what one of the arguments here is. That it's something about deterioration and identity. And before I sort of move on to these sort of applications of these ideas and what we can do with them, what we can learn from them, I also wanted to issue a word of caution, really. Because when you look at the experiential knowledge of disabled people with genetic conditions, it seems almost quite obvious that these are perspectives that we need within genomics. And we really need that kind of people who will be affected in all those different types of ways that I mentioned at the start of the talk. But experiential knowledge, much like medical knowledge, also has its limitations. It's not an infallible body of knowledge. And I wanted to highlight that by bringing up a quotation from, his name is Graham, he was 59, and he had haemophilia. And he argued that the trouble is, how I thought about having it, haemophilia, in my 20s and 30s, when I was having my own children, is very different to now. Back then, it didn't affect my joints too badly. I was able to ignore it most of the time, unlike now. Because, yeah, your haemophilia might be fine for the first 20, 30 odd years of your life, but it doesn't mean it will stay that way. So one of the findings was also then was around almost the instability of this type of knowledge, that it's forever being processed, revised, it's constantly subject to revision. So can we impart this type of knowledge to parents when it's almost like you feel a bit like a butterfly catcher with a net trying to this really interesting, in-depth knowledge that they've got and trying to make it more accessible to people for whom it's going to be relevant. And it will become relevant to more and more people. They will want to know, okay, if I've been found to be a carrier of something, then evaluating what a child's life with that condition might be means that this type of experiential knowledge could be really useful. So to kind of summarise some of the key findings that I've brought up today, and to summarise before I sort of talk a little bit about policy. So I found that the lived reality and the social dimensions of genetic impairment is critical to reproductive attitudes amongst families and adults living with genetic conditions. So what I'm really trying to make the point of here is that by relying on the sort of lists of symptoms that we cannot ever fully accurately capture in a whole way, the way that this condition will be experienced by people in real life. There are so many unknowns, and it has been argued that we need more sort of social interventions, I suppose, to increase people's knowledge of what these conditions are like. And I also found that the meaning that was assigned to that lived reality is greatly influenced by the nature of impairment experiences, but also the politics and psychology of personal identity. And this is why I think we saw this very different range of views across the impairment groups. And thalassemia consistently came out as being much more militantly pro-screening than any other group. I mean, I think from their survey, the last time I looked at it, 99% of them agreed with that screening should be introduced. And I think that's particularly interesting because the thalassemia community often are of South Asian origin, which has particular ideas about illness and the transferability of illness. So within particular contexts, a disability could completely change its meaning. So that's something else to think about when considering the importance of the social aspects of genetic disorders. And I found that the classifications of disease severity that are often used to make some of these really difficult decisions about, incidental findings, abortion, the notion of disease severity as it is defined by medicine aren't necessarily helpful in being able to predict what a child's life would be. So as I say, in the case of Rosie and her sister Chloe, a clinician would likely look at the type 2 child and say, yes, well, this is the more severe child. But when you actually go into their accounts of their experiences, it was the older sister with the milder condition that actually struggled with it far more. So it's really hard to kind of get that type of information to families. And finally, lived experience is also limited. And I think in the same way that medical clinical knowledge is always limited, so is lived experience. It's subject to revision in light of changing circumstances, but also physical deterioration, or if a new treatment becomes available, people almost go back and rewrite their experiences in line with the changed event. So I think what I'm saying here with this last point is that the experiential knowledge of these families is really important, but we have to remember its idiosyncratic nature in that it will give people a much more in-depth understanding of what life with the condition is like, but it shouldn't be overstated that, if this child has it this way, you will also have it this way. But I think, nevertheless, it does offer really interesting insights into the social realities of disability that we just don't otherwise see. So I wanted to, before we move on to any questions, is to leave you really with some thoughts about what this all means. How can we, or and whether the lived experience of disabled adults and families inform the goals and practice of clinical genetics? Are they a relevant stakeholder group? Some people would argue not. Some people say this actually has nothing to do with disabled people. This is about members of the population gaining autonomy over their own reproduction. But as I mentioned to you in the earlier slides, it will affect people with genetic conditions. There are impacts for them. So from that point of view, even if they're not making reproductive decisions themselves, there is still an impact. So how can we and how should we understand that lived experience and bring it into clinical context, or should we not? Because in Denmark, I don't know if you saw this, there was a documentary, I think, last year. In Denmark now, when a child is diagnosed through prenatal diagnosis as having Down syndrome, they are automatically referred to go and visit with a family who have a child with Down syndrome. Because in Denmark, they've really thought that this type of knowledge is so important that they want to be able to facilitate the exchange of that information. I mean, I think there are lots of challenges associated with that. It's not, you don't learn experiential knowledge in the same way that you might learn your medical education. It's not that type of knowledge. It's much more visceral than that. So what are the most effective ways, if we agree that this is important, of getting it to the people who would need it most? And what are the challenges with using lived experience in this way? Is it going to lead to people thinking, well, once I've met one child, I'm going to fully understand what my child will be like? And this might be confusing for conditions like SMA, where there's a really big, when there's a really big spectrum of severity. And if testing can't tell us accurately where on that scale of severity a child will be, lived experience, again, can help us understand the range of experiences with the condition. So these are some papers from the study, and I just wanted to talk to you briefly about dissemination and impact, and then we'll have, I think, about the 15 minutes for the questions. So the way that this research is being used, it's being used in screening reviews by the National Screening Committee. Up until now, there was no data on what adults and families with SMA thought about screening in the UK. The data just didn't exist, and I do think that's a lot to do with this idea that, you know, public health genomics doesn't apply to disabled people. So I've been including some of the data in policy consultation reviews, but also we're trying to get the general public interested in these issues and what it might mean for them in the future. So we're also doing an art installation around some of these themes that come up around genomic medicine, café scientifiques, that kind of engagement with the press as well. So there's some radio and articles that you can look up if you're interested. But I also have spoken to professionals in various capacities, both within and outside of medicine, to be able to, I suppose, allow them to engage with genetics and the experience of disabled people in perhaps ways they haven't done before. And finally, obviously, papers, academic conferences, and I also incorporated the findings into teaching. And I've put on the final slide, if the papers are a bit too heavy and you just want a sort of snapshot about some of this, I've also put up some links to sort of articles in the press that are related to this project. I think that takes us to the end. Yes, that was my last slide. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, really thought-provoking and fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about how you chose the conditions? Because it's striking how different the feelings were and responses, and so therefore those decisions that you probably made at the very start of the project turn out to be really important.
Yeah.
And if you could go back, are the ones you now think, gosh, it would have been really fascinating to talk to people living with these conditions?
So the conditions were originally chosen because at the time I was writing the bid, and obviously these things take a long time to sort of come into fruition. The time I was writing the bid, all of those conditions were included on the additional findings panel of the 100,000 Genomes project. So I wanted to be able to do a comparison between how affected families with those conditions viewed it versus the way in which sequencing volunteers who could potentially find out their carrier status for those conditions, how they viewed it when they came from a background of non-experience of that condition. As you say, it really has been striking the differences between those groups. I wanted diversity, and that was partly as well why I wanted to include Fragile X syndrome, because the other conditions don't have associated cognitive impairment, and I thought that was really important because in previous interviews I've done with families, things are said like, you know, well, if it's just a physical condition, then I can cope with that, but if it's anything to do with their mind and brain, I can't cope with that. So I wanted to explore that further because I think that there is a kind of particular stigma associated with both learning disabilities and mental health issues as well. So this kind of prioritising of the physical. Whether or not I would change the conditions, I don't know, because I think actually it's worked out quite well in terms of picking up on the contrast. But if I hadn't included thalassemia, I wouldn't have seen that contrast. It would come across as much more critical. So I think I probably would have liked to do more research rather than take any off the list. And I think I'd like to look at sickle cell and conditions where it tends to affect particular ethnic groups more than others, to see whether or not that makes a difference to how people view it, and trying to understand whether that's what I saw was going on with thalassemia.
If I could just ask one more question, sorry for hogging the microphone. It's about the generalizable nature of it. So, and the question of how to use this data. So, it's clear that experiences vary widely, both between different groups and even within groups, as you pointed out very clearly. And so, while programs like the Danish, you know, if you're diagnosed with this condition, put them in touch with families, on the face of it, that seems very inclusive and reflective of lived experience. But then because everyone's lived experience is so different, you know, how representative is it? And I guess what I'm looking for is the magic answer, but for how to communicate the complexity of the lived experience without overgeneralizing it, both to policymakers and to families.
What was interesting I found was that there were that although, like for example, thalassemia and SMA were quite polarized in their views, I did also find that there were themes that had kept coming up across the groups. So I think that there were some aspects of the analysis that are generalizable because it kept occurring. I kept having the same themes over and over again. But I also think, coming back to your point about sort of how reliable and how helpful those kinds of programs are, like we see in Denmark, I think it also, one of the things that worries me the most about it is the pressure that it puts on the family. And, you know, would there be any follow-up? Would that family then say, well, did they come and look at my child and decide to terminate theirs? And that is a big emotional risk for those families in terms of how they cope with it. I don't know, but I mean, many of the families I spoke to had become almost quite hardy to it, and they were very used to dealing with negative public attitudes. But when it comes to something like this, whether it's about who gets to live, I think it can touch people particularly deeply. So I think there are concerns about how it could be implemented as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Felicity. That was fascinating. I was really interested in the quote from your respondent with haemophilia at the end about the way in which the experience had changed over time.
Yes.
And I was kind of interested. I kind of wanted to hear more about that and about whether that kind of biography, whether you talk about specific genetic conditions as having different types of biography, and whether those are consistent across the conditions that you look at. Because I think often when we talk about genetic conditions, we tend to talk about the predictive, and we tend to talk about them as quite stable, and because they're genes and they don't change. And whereas this is really interesting because this kind of links much more with questions around aging and chronic disease and things like that. And I think it's quite interesting to.
It absolutely does. It's much more. That's why I think it's kind of much more of a slippery concept in that way, in that it kind of it does change over time. And I think the parents were really making the case as well that actually the point in your life when you're making reproductive decisions is, on average, early 30s. And he was saying that in his 20, 30 odd years, he was fine. And it's also the fact that when you base a reproductive decision on experiential knowledge, you've only got what you know up until that point. And what's going on in your life at that time is going to influence how you look back at your life and how you make sense of it. And that's why I think you often hear sort of parents of disabled children who want to make sense of it, will often say things like, well, this child was sent to us because we are well equipped to handle it, or whatever the reason might be. But I do think people search for meanings in those particular situations. And I think I've missed your other question.
No, I think it was all one question.
Okay.
It's a long one.
Thank you.
It completely makes sense to me that somebody with a lived experience in a family or in themselves of a condition may have a strength of feeling about prenatal testing for that condition. But did you find that any of the individuals with SMA or CF or thalassemia or haemophilia had strong feelings about prenatal testing for other conditions?
That's something I did ask, because I wanted to know, okay, if we have this experiential knowledge and we view it as this quite important resource of knowledge, is it transferable between conditions? So in the surveys, we're including a question which looks at prenatal. It sort of sets up the question looking at prenatal testing and selective termination. And the participants are invited to say whether they strongly disagree, strongly agree, and everything in between for these particular statements. And the statements are, they don't relate to particular condition diagnoses necessarily, but they are things like, if the child may never grow taller than an 8-year-old, if the child would live a healthy life up until age 50, but then die at age 50, there were loads of different scenarios that we could explore, whether or not having experience of, say, SMA in your family makes you more or less likely to terminate for other conditions. And we're still analysing that data at the moment. But what we found so far is that for social conditions, so on that list, we had things like the mother doesn't want to have any more children, or she's just broken up with the baby's father. So we had those situations. And we found that the responses were very similar between people without and people with experiential knowledge. But what they differed on was the medical questions. And we found that because we've got a data set that has used the same question, we didn't write the question, it was taken from another survey that was completed by women who were undergoing Down syndrome screening. So these are women from the general population. And we found that those women were twice as likely than someone with SMA in their family to terminate for a hypothetical medical condition. So there were definite, I think, differences between those two groups, and we're still continuing to do that analysis now, but it has come up, and I think it is important, like, how does this, if we're sort of problematizing the idea of, like, diagnostic boundaries, because we've seen in here, they don't always tell us what we need to hear, because sometimes, the whole experience of disability can't be encompassed within that.
So that's really interesting. So it's the idea that somebody with a disability then becomes more compassionate about their perception of other disabilities.
We saw that, I think, is one of the first quote, this idea that it becomes a transformative experience. And as well with the interviews I did with children with Down syndrome, the mothers often went, well, was that it? Was that all I was worrying about? It doesn't seem so bad now my child is here and we're getting on with it. And yes, his progress is slower, but he still makes progress, and that's the most important part. So I do think that, yes, it is a very transformative experience, and I think it really highlights that we have a lot of negative ideas about disability. The fact that so many people are challenged when they actually have a child with a disability, and are sort of, like the first quote, almost shocked when they go back and look at what their beliefs were before they had that experience. And I suppose what I'm thinking about with this project is everyone's going to be in that situation, barring these people living with the conditions, but everyone's going to be facing those kinds of decisions where they feel like they haven't got the knowledge and the insight that these families have got, but nevertheless, they've got to make life or death decisions as it relates to fetuses.
So what in terms of filmed experiences, for example, could we as a community collectively make about the experiences of disability? I mean, I understand there are projects around that are starting to do that. Are you feeding into any, or do you have any ideas about that?
Not at the moment, but I think, well, there's loads of issues that, you mean what sort of issues might cut across?
Well, I'm just wondering about what resources could we as a community help to create that would be helpful for families facing difficult decisions?
Oh, that's a tough one. Because I don't think there's any easy answers to that one. So what resources should be available to members of the public? Well, I do think that forms of lived experience would be really useful for them to access. And I think the way that I'd imagined it, probably working better, rather than actually people going and meeting and spending time with families, I'd imagined it more in a kind of like film way, as you were saying, that you could have these videos and people could access the information on a website, so that if you're accessing it on a website rather than meeting the person, you kind of get the freedom then to react to it in any way you want without feeling like you're being judged for it. And you can also access it at any time you want, so you could, to make sure you're in the right frame of mind to receive that information. So I think there are ways of doing it, and I think there are avenues to bring film into this, certainly. And I think that's a really powerful medium, actually, for communicating some of these really difficult ideas about lived experience.
Sorry to hog the mic. Could you tell us a bit more about your Public Engagement Award and the installation that's in your head?
Yes, yeah. So the installation is currently under development at the moment. And we wanted to capture some of the themes that have come out of the data. So we were looking at things like ideas about responsibility, ideas about stigma, ideas about what suffering is, all these kinds of ideas. So what we've done is we're going to have a sort of, whether it or not it'll end up being in a box or whether it will just be set up in each room we go to. But the idea is that you walk into a space that you hear lots of different voices talking about genetics. And the idea is that at first this is quite an almost claustrophobic experience. You can't sort of make sense of it because they're talking over each other. But as you move around this installation, the voices come in and out of focus, and you can act. And I would see that as enabling the public to access perspectives they wouldn't normally otherwise be able to. But it's a very sensitive topic area, how people make these kinds of decisions. I think that's part of the reason why we find that public dialogue quite hard, because we're asking people to share with us, something as intimate as their ideas towards reproductive decision making. So, but we're all feeling very excited about it and hoping to start that off soon.
Any more questions or thoughts or comments? Yes. I'm going to run up. Just grab one.
Hi, I was just wondering if you'd come across any stories of how money influences people's decisions at a personal level. Like, did people talk about that at all? Or?
Not to a great extent, not as much as I was expecting them to, especially with the cuts that have been made to disability benefits. So I was surprised that it didn't come up more than it did. People actually, when they were talking about having a child with one of the conditions, they seem to talk more about the family's personal resources in terms of their emotional and physical well-being. That seemed to be more important than the money side of it. And certainly if money was important, I mean, I'm sure it was to a degree, but it wasn't something that came up in the interviews regularly, which I was quite surprised at. And there are certainly concerns that if screening is sort of expanded, that concerns about support and money could actually get worse.
Any other questions? Can I actually put Sarah on the spot here? Sarah's a genetic counsellor from Adam Brooks Hospital, and as part of being a genetic counsellor, will counsel families who are having prenatal testing or thinking about PGD or, making choices. Is there anything that you want to say? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Is there anything you want to say about the experience of families?
Yeah, so thank you. I suppose just commenting on some of the conditions you've got up there.
Yeah.
I can only comment on what we do at Addenbrooke, so obviously I'm not speaking on behalf of the whole of the UK here. In terms of haemophilia, we barely ever have any parents in pregnancy referred to us due to haemophilia. So most of them don't want to consider prenatal diagnosis. They're managed by the haemophilia unit at Addenbrooke, so we don't really see them in clinical genetics. In terms of SMA, the majority of the prenatal referrals we get are for couples usually where the baby has had SMA type 0 or type 1, where they've seen their baby die when it's a few days old or a few months old. So I guess my sort of main comment is we very much see it from the perspective of the parents and the impact that the child has had on the family and other siblings. So sometimes we have parents where they've seen a baby die and their other children have been severely affected by that as well. And the wider family, you know, grandparents, aunts, uncles and things, and how they feel they may be able to cope watching another child die. So for milder conditions, or as you say, you know, SMA type 2 or type 3, we usually wouldn't get requests for those sorts of things. Sometimes Down syndrome, but to be honest, most of the time Down syndrome isn't dealt with by clinical genetics, it's the midwives, because it's a national screening programme for all pregnant women in the UK. So it's the midwives who are giving the information to pregnant women and seeing them for results and things. So very rarely do we get referrals for prenatal testing for Down syndrome. So I think for the majority of what we do, it's for families where they've had much more severe ends of the spectrum in their experiences, and that's what they're asking for prenatal testing for. Not always, but quite often.
I suppose the question that I'm asking with this project is, but where is that line then? Where is that line of severity? And we did have a few families who'd had prenatal diagnosis for haemophilia A, understood to be the severest form. And I mean, this whole piece of work started with me looking at SMA because I was so interested in the fact that under one diagnosis you've got, in its most severe form, as you say, babies dying very young, but all the way through types 3 and 4, where people are living, you know, average lifespans and have great freedom and fulfilling lives. And as far as I understand it at the moment, there's no sort of foolproof way of being absolutely 100% sure which type of SMA that child's going to have. So I think there needs to be some almost like collective thinking about, as a society, what do we think is severe? And how can that be put into policy? And how far do our interpretations of what a severe condition is draw on our own experiences? And what can we learn from the experiences of others?
Any other thoughts? No? Okay, fantastic. I think we're there at the end now. So can we thank Felicity one more time?
Thank you.